What are the top 5 best novels about World War II? And I am pumped up today, everyone. I got my camel print on, and I am ready to do what men do, which is rant about World War II. And this video is so compelling to me because I know men who know nothing about nothing, who pursue nothing intellectual in their life. But if you get them going about World War II, they start speaking like scholars. They start acting like generals. They somehow turn into men of knowledge. And almost everyone, especially men, have their opinions, these ideas about World War II. And that's what also makes this so compelling. Somehow, after 80 years, the grand narrative, how we conceive World War II, has basically stayed the same. If you look at other wars like the War on Terror or Vietnam, the Gulf War, or any other conflict, even if it's not related to war, our conception of it evolves over time. But the World War II narrative, for many different reasons, has remained very stagnant. And novelists, more so than anyone, can puncture that. And that's who we're going to be talking about today. Some of the best books and authors of all time, because novels provide us an opportunity to break free of, if Rommel just had 100 more Panzer IIIs, he would have been able not to conquer just North Africa, but the world. And all the other technical trivialities that don't really matter. Novels are an exploration of the interior, of the real stories that people experienced, not just as soldiers, but in all aspects of the war. And my name is Ian, and here on Right Conscious, we talk about transformative literature. All the books I'm going to be talking about today can mind blow you, make you think, make you ponder questions later, make you reflect on yourself. And that's what I'm interested in, because I know that literature is something more than what it's being turned into right now. And so, of course, the first book of the day, I'm gonna have to bring in the heavyweight, the best World War II book ever written. And that is, of course, William T. Vollmann's Europe Central. And the reason that this novel smacks is that Vollmann has distance from the war. This was released in the early 2000s. Vollmann wasn't a World War II veteran. He has no sentimental attachment to anything that happened and many of the canonical truths that we're supposed to believe. Vollmann is also a risk taker. He doesn't really care. And so he writes about characters and ideas that would have been taboo back in the day and are still somewhat taboo today if you say them as a famous political figure. But because he's kind of a reclusive novelist, he can really explore the war in depth with none of the caution signs that many others have to view the conflict through. And Vollmann is also a generational talent and extremely smart, smarter than you, I, or anyone else we know outside of maybe like World War II scholars about the war. And what makes him more intelligent than those scholars is that he lets himself feel and be consumed by the characters and not view them through this technical way. And Vollmann is a weird dude. If you guys see up there the photo of him, that person back up to the left of him is someone named Dolores, which is who he cross-dresses as occasionally. So I know this all may be very off-putting because people who usually click on a World War II video don't want to have some cross-dressing maniac from California who is a wizard of the mind telling them about their favorite conflict. But that's exactly who we need, because in Europe Central, Vollmann, first and foremost, writes beautifully, writes in a maximalist, somewhat journalist way about the war like I've never seen before. But he focuses in the chapters on certain figures who had to make decisions at pivotal times in the war. He writes from the perspective of Lenin's wife, of the composer Shostakovich, from Russian generals' perspectives, from German generals' perspectives, from SS officers' perspectives, from artists and filmmakers' perspectives, and so many others, from civilians' perspectives. And he pulls no punches. He isn't scared to sentimentalize the Germans. He's not scared to show the tear that Russia was inflicting on its citizens. He's not scared to show some of the absurdity of the Americans and some of the Western figures. And in this book is a high amount of detail. historical points and things that happened that you probably never knew that happened that were very impactful on certain aspects of the war. We see some of the more famous and controversial figures not just put on paper, but were given a door to their mind, to their decisions, how they felt to the last moment of their life, how they felt about defecting from one side to the other, about killing Jews, about all these different things. And we just get it all. And this novel is a reflection, an odyssey on violence, on the real impact of the war beyond, like I said, the technical details, because those don't matter. Like, those are fun to study, and I love to think about it and listen to history podcasts and audio books about it. But what was really happening in the war? And Europe Central explores that. Like I said, it's from a very eccentric figure, but that's who we need to kind of open up the pathway for us to kind of discuss this conflict with a sense of detachment, because we're still not detached. People still call each other communists and fascists and Nazis, even though those people actually aren't the embodiment of the original definition. We are still emotionally attached to the war, and Volman can kind of help unglue us from it. And so if you are one of those people who likes the technical details, you will love this, because you will just be immersed in this world. And so shout out to William T. Volman. This is always a really good read, and I would say is a good summer read. And so speaking of maximalist novels, number 2 on the list is Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, which is an eccentric postmodernist exploration of the end of World War II. Because many times when I'm listening to an audiobook or thinking about World War II, the end of the war happens pretty fast. The Battle of the Bulge happens, and then Hitler gives up, yada, yada, yada. The nuclear bomb is dropped and it's over. But we never really explore how many of the insane figures that got put into positions of power, whether in the military or in the corporate sector or the intelligence sector, how the war ended for them, how their grand plans and the power that they had kind of comes to a close. Because what's odd about World War II is that in the early 20th century, there was an East meets West explosion. This created like modernist writing, because people like Ezra Pound and William Carlos Williams started to read, Li Po and all these other Chinese writers. And they're like, oh my God, this is what we're missing. This will break us free from Victorian influences. But there was also suddenly this flood of information involving the occult and metaphysics, classic yogic texts and Buddhist meditation principles that started to be found and synthesized into Western principles of magic and the occult by people like Aleister Crowley and that whole crew in England and in other places. And many of these people started to weasel their way in. And sometimes not the famous people, but people who actually believed in these philosophies at a deep level started to gain power, as I just said, in the intelligence, military, government, and corporate sectors. And so Pynchon does a beautiful job of showing some of these absurd characters to us, and uses the frame of the end of the war and the V2 rocket and some of the programming campaigns that some of these groups went on for the entirety of the war. He frames the novel through that, and it's just insanity. There is drugs, sex, insane rants, crazy symbolism, and it really shows how power coalesces at the end of a war, what happens in the zone. Because many of these places that had been destroyed or had been conquered just didn't go back to normal immediately. And a lot of the time, they were overtaken in their destruction by people with power. And so this novel takes the bomb, the rocket, the weaponry of World War II and turns it into something metaphysical, which is innovative, which is great, which helps us transcend the numbers and think about these relationships. And this is something that Pynchon does. He did it in Bleeding Edge with the internet and with other things in many of his novels. It shows us how a rocket or the internet aren't these just detached objective things that we can just quantify and observe. He shows us how they affect us. How literally the phallic nature of the bomb, how the dark web of the internet, like literally the web of it affects us, how it sucks our soul into it. And if it's all sounding crazy to you, well, then go check out Thomas Pynchon and he'll show you a new perspective. This is a refresher for people about the dark side, the occult side, the eccentric side of the war that, like I said, we'll maybe hear talked about by that one dude, I forget his name, who wrote that book called Blitz about the drugs in the war. But this is that on steroids by probably one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. And another thing I really like that he does is he strips away a lot of the patriotic mythology involving the war and shows it as a psychosexual death ritual, which it kind of is. We've had this glorified perception of war and still do. And we don't say like, oh, support our veterans, you're our hero. We don't think of them being these players in this psychosexual death ritual. And maybe you don't believe that, but Pynchon kind of gives that angle, and it's very, very compelling. I also really like how it shows kind of the power of not just war and the insanity of war, but shows how capitalism and science, genocide, religion are all complicit in it and are really the same exact mentality. Many of these institutions, many of these things that we've been given, science, religion, capitalism, our economic systems, how we treat others, our systems of government, are not the final being, are not the highest order, not the transcendental signifier of what we could be doing. But it's the box that we've been put in and have to deal with. And like I said, novelists are some of the best people to break us out of that. And World War II is a box that we're still stuck in. Many of the problems, for instance, how land was distributed after the war, how some of the countries rose or fell after the war, the Middle East, all relates back to World War II. And so it's really cool to think about. And Pynchon has mementos about Africa and Israel and like other places that are pretty cool. So now I want to stop ranking these. I think the final 8 are all just kind of in a pool of A or B tier. I feel like Europe Central and Gravity's Rainbow are an order above them in terms of writing ability and scope and what they are trying on a literary level. And that doesn't mean that they are better. It just means that they're more advanced. And many times in like Europe Central and in Gravity's Rainbow, we don't get that human connection of the war, which is important. And so I think a lot of these novels that we're going to talk about, maybe not as much Slaughterhouse-Five, are going to kind of capture that. But I feel like as an author, it's not easy to capture that. It's really, really hard to do that. But to be able to capture something as large as World War II, like Pynchon and Vollmann did, I think it shows the highest level of mastery. So next we have Kurt Vonnegut's kind of anti-war novel, Slaughterhouse-Five. And this one, of course, has to make the list, because Slaughterhouse-Five is kind of a soft-core version of Gravity's Rainbow. We have the sci-fi element with the Tralfamadorians or whatever their names are. But then we also have the trauma angle. And it's interesting because when people read this book, a lot of the time, they just see these aliens as a projection of Billy Pilgrim's trauma. You know, how people loop and fragment and kind of become unstuck in time because of their trauma, which is what happens. But I think that Vonnegut plays with it enough that it doesn't turn into that, because I love some of the contrast that he does here. And first, I should say that this is a great novel because it was ahead of its time about Dresden. That Vonnegut, was pushing this idea of Dresden that people didn't want to believe, that had been shielded from the public, that Americans were bombing civilians. And we're still, one of the narratives that we're still stuck in is that when we say like, oh, the Americans bombed Dresden and like, oh, we dropped a nuclear bomb. Well, they did this. And it's like, yes. Are we still that emotionally attached? Yes. Hitler did this. Hitler was the greater of the two evils. Yes, he did this. But does that mean that we should do this? And that type of logic, a lot of the time, shows more base consciousness type thinking. We see this a lot with the Israel conflict. Well, this happened, they did this, so then we get to do this. We have endless justification to do this. And it's like, yeah, we can play that game all day. Yeah, you can do that. You can continue to do that forever, sure. But is that the highest order of thinking and going about the situation? And so through the way that Vonnegut tells it, he makes it really feel like Dresden was a war crime without it necessarily having to confront that, having to think about that. And another reason I really like this one is that when you look at kind of the Hemingway model of the modern soldier, we have this traumatized man, this hero who's stoic, but Billy Pilgrim in this novel is a bureaucratic man. He's a corporate man. He is what I think I've seen called like, he's a sleepwalker of history. He is one of these many men who just was thrown. They weren't the lost generation. They were just like the invisible generation. They were just thrown back into this world after a conflict that was just as traumatizing and insane. And the world, because of technology and the radio and the television, moved on without them. The children of the soldiers of World War I who maybe served in World War II weren't that different from their parents. But the children of some of the young people who served in World War II that served in Vietnam, that's a huge divide between World War II and then we have fucking Black Sabbath. And so this novel really shows kind of the trauma and kind of the life of many of these people after the war. You know, it's crazy. My grandfather was in World War II and, you know, had to re-assimilate he was Canadian, back into his nice little life in Markham, Ontario, being a county lawyer or whatever. And so, of course, Slaughterhouse-Five has to be on this list. I mean, it's a good book, so it goes. I read it this last year with my students. 2 years ago, I read it with my students and it got canceled by all the religious folks because it mentioned seminal fluids or sexual fluids. And oh my God. But yeah, the kids love this one. This one is still a novel that can hit and keep people interested, which is becoming a rare thing for novels in general, especially ones written before the 2000s. And so next on our list, so if you are a fan of the Eastern Front, you are going to love Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman. This is a sprawling novel, over 900 pages, where Grossman, who was a correspondent in Stalingrad and was there, provides you with a ton of details. I remember reading, I think, the Anthony Beaver book, is that his name's book on Stalingrad, and listening to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History series on the Eastern Front. And this was kind of the fiction book that was recommended to me. And it's a bit of a slog, but what's interesting about this one is that Vasily is not scared to go after Stalinism. Like, even though this book is about like the Nazis and them attacking and some of their malignant aspects, this book was taken from him by the KGB in 1959, and his typewriter and all his drafts and all his writing was destroyed by them. And somehow a copy remained and got smuggled out in the 1980s to be published posthumously. But he really explores how evil the Soviet Union was. Because what's the difference between a Holocaust death camp and the Gulag? Obviously, there's differences, but it's still just people dying uselessly for the state. And, you know, a lot of the novel is set up by characters betraying their principles to have to align with Stalinism and some of their thoughts and some of what they have to go through, because that's a big deal that I think Europe Central, explores pretty well. But how do you reckon with it? Like, we don't have to really align with anything. The choices that we have to make in complicated political situations are so easy and have basically no ramifications most of the time. And if they do, it's usually not death. But in these situations, it is. And I think that Grossman really hits the nail on the head with this one. Like I said, this is a long novel. So is Europe Central and Gravity's Rainbow, all over 800 pages. And so you have to be motivated to finish this. But it's a pretty good one, I would say, after you finish those, to just kind of get more of an in-depth look at the Eastern Front, which is basically, I think, in my opinion, the most interesting part of the war. So next on the list, there is Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. And I actually have a confession to make about this one. I didn't read it until I was like a lot older, like 25, 26, because in college I had heard about it, but there was this dude my freshman year when I was at university in the dorms, and he started dating this girl I really wanted to date. And I didn't do a very good job of picking her up. I could have done it. I just needed to have a little bit more exuberance, and I was lost with other chicks. But this dude would carry around his copy of Joseph Heller's Catch-22 like everywhere. Like, I don't know if he hadn't finished it or what, but every time I saw him the entire year from like September to May, this dude had the book. So I was like, you know what? I'm not reading this. This guy must be dumb. But then I finally picked it up during one of my university classes. And it's a pretty deep book. It shows how these modern institutions basically are designed to trap us. He gave us the new grammar and a new way of thinking about entrapment. You know, I was just talking about the Gulag and the Holocaust, and there is a certain language that every institution and country has to make to get people to go to war. But as our wars get more absurd, like for instance, if we go to war with Iran and we have to put boots on the ground, the government's going to start using a certain language like Osama bin Laden bombed us because they hated our freedom. Like, okay, really? But the logic that is used during these conflicts, whatever it is only for the benefit of the state, of the system. And so Catch-22 is a great satirical novel up there with Slaughterhouse-Five that explores, and I should say exposes, so many of the contradictions that aren't just laws. It's literally the metaphysical principles of how we've built our military-industrial complex. Like, for instance, there's countless things in here, like only a general can say that you can leave the military, but you can't get released until you complete all your missions. but the generals keep adding more missions on your plate. So you can never complete them until you die. And so I don't want to give away too much about the plot. I'm trying not to spoil too much, honestly, in any of these novels. But if you are a fan of Slaughterhouse-Five, if you're looking for something that's not as technical, then this is a book for you. This is a book that can help you awaken, that can help you hopefully see more truth and have more clarity on not just war, but situations in your own life. There are so many double binds and catch-22s in general that we have to face every single day. Like, for instance, this past year, I'll admit it right now, I shut off the bell at my school. I just shut it off, everyone. The bell. The catch-22 of the school bell is that we're supposed to be creating these free thinkers, but in actuality, they're just Pavlovian dogs. You know, I removed the clock out of the room too, banned phones, so no one knows what time it is. Because as soon as someone knows there's 2 minutes left, everyone starts rustling and getting weird. As soon as they hear a bell, we could be having a breakthrough moment. I've had breakthrough moments with students and with classes, and the bell rings, and then everyone just, and then they leave. And even if you tell everyone, don't worry about the bell, then you're making people rebellious. You're making people say, oh, F that. So the only thing you can do is shut off the bell. And I did that, and I had amazing results in my classroom just because of that. But ask anyone else, well, how are you going to hear an announcement about a school shooter? What if everyone dies? It's going to be your fault. Okay, that's probably true. But there's this much of a chance, if not less, the smallest chance in the world that there's going to be a school shooter. But there's a much higher chance that if I let these kids leave my classroom, not better readers and writers, that they'll never confront anyone in their life because their parents didn't do anything to help them, that are going to try and actually teach them reading and writing. That is a real life or death situation. Anyway, you can view so many situations in your life and just be like, you know what? I'm going to try to opt out of this. This thing that seems like it's literally a law is just a screwdriver away from being transcended.